In part 1 of this video, we covered the early life and upbringing of David and his slow but eventual rise to kingship. Now, David was king. His rule was secured, the brief war of assassinations and infighting over the last vestiges of the house of Saul were over, and he had sons to continue his line too, through his several wives, a lot of which aren't particularly relevant, except the one or two which will be exceptionally so. One of his first acts were to finally conquer Jerusalem, which all this while had been held by the pagan Yevusi tribes, and once it was his, built it up as his capital, hiring foreign carpenters and stonemasons to build elegant and proud palaces, and had even more children with even more wives. In addition, the old wars against the Philistines continued in the meanwhile, and David battled them back repeatedly, destroying their armies to protect his lands, and in retribution for them killing his old friends. But things weren't all perfect. His first wife, Michal, the daughter of King Saul, took pretty great annoyance with him and all these actions in regards to the other women, so they didn't get along so well anymore, and he never had any children by her. But besides for all that, things were going pretty well. He, with the help of his chief general, an incredibly talented tactician named Achitophel, and his chief officer, Yoav, beat the Philistines back repeatedly. The Moabites became an issue yet again, however, and he defeated them and made them into tributary vassals. He broke the king of Zobah by the Euphrates and conquered the Arameans when they became an issue. So, overall, things were going much better than when Saul had been doing things. In fact, in honor of his old friend Yonasan, he managed to track down Yonasan's remaining son, a crippled boy by the name of Mephibosheth, who he basically adopted to continue the line and honor the memory of his old friend. So, times were good. It was a prosperous time, the people were happy, and the country was safe. And then David messed up. If you're sensing a bit of a pattern here with the previous king of everything going great and fantastic and then they making some massive blunder which causes enormous problems for them, then you'd be right. Shame he hadn't learned from the mistakes of his predecessor, but, here we are. Basically, what happened was David was relaxing, taking a nice walk along the roof of his palace, when he happened to glance down into the city through a window and saw this woman. She was remarkably beautiful, and he decided that he wanted to marry her. He inquired a bit around and found out that her name was Batsheva, however, she was already married. But that's no issue when you're the king, so he had her summoned, and in the meanwhile, arranged with Yoav, his chief officer, for her husband, a man named Uriah, a soldier in his army, to be placed in the front lines where the hardest and most dangerous fighting was taking place, and in addition for soldiers to fall back behind him to leave him on his own. The report came back a while later. Uriah was dead, slain in battle, and after Batsheva was done mourning for her husband, she was married to David. This was a pretty egregiously wrong thing to do, and God thought so too. The last time a king had erred like this, they and their sons were killed, and the kingship was stripped from their line. So things weren't looking too great for David's future. He realized his wrongdoing soon after, and repented extensively, but still, the child born of his union with Batsheva died of an illness within a week of its birth, and he was told by the prophets that calamity would soon fall upon his house because of this sin. He did have a second son later on with Batsheva, a boy who survived and was named Solomon, but that's more relevant later. In the meantime, let's look at David's other elder children. He had a son by the name of Avshalom, who was an incredibly handsome boy, some might say crossing so far into being vain, with beautiful long hair that he took great care of. He was a strong-willed, bold person who tended to take matters into his own hands, particularly the event with his sister Tamar. They had a half-brother named Amnon who was infatuated with Tamar, so much so to the point where he arranged with a friend to get her into seclusion, manipulating her kindness by feigning illness and requesting her assistance before assaulting her. When she told her brother, Avshalom, he was absolutely outraged. David found out too, and for whatever reason didn't do much about it, or at least not enough for Avshalom to be satisfied. So, angry at his father's ineffectiveness and absolutely furious at his half-brother, he bided his time, waited a period, until things had calmed down somewhat and had his brother over for a feast, waited until Amnon was drunk, and then had all the attendants draw knives and stab him to death. This event utterly fractured the family, or at least more than the previous atrocity had, and Avshalom ran away and wasn't seen by his father for the next 3 years. David was devastated by all these events, but there was nothing to be done any longer. So the years passed, and they were separate. David mourned all the while, and Avshalom had his own thoughts on matters, presumably being fairly disillusioned by all the events. David was moping around his castle when his chief officer, Yoav, ever a practical man, basically knocked some sense back into him and set him on the path to make reparations with his son. And when they finally, a while later, reconciled, they hugged, but things could never again be like they once were. There was a rift driven between them, and while David thought things had been resolved, Avshalom thought anything but. In fact, all the whiles away, he had come to the conclusion that his father was a poor, ineffective king, and the resolution would have to be to seize the throne for himself. And so, Avshalom began his conspiracy. As of now, he had no soldiers, no alliances, and no loyalties sworn to him, which are all pretty necessary to run a kingdom, let alone overthrow one, but he did have a significant advantage, which was A, the element of surprise, and B, the hearts of the people. See, similar to David in his youth, the people loved Avshalom, the young prince. He was incredibly handsome after all, and his long, beautiful hair and delicate features made for a striking image. He was charismatic, a man of the people, and while David was out doing his kingly war duties, Avshalom had gone around ingratiating himself in the eyes of the people. He was almost a more popular figure than the king himself, so he began slowly, at first, using all this to advantage and undermining his father. He would go out to the city gates and speak to the people gathered there, spreading word of his father's poor judgment and slow action, and if only, say, someone like him was in charge, things could be so much better for everybody. He spoke to people personally and shook hands and hugged people, which was pretty exciting for everyone, him being the beloved prince and all the while spreading his malicious lies, and slowly the people turned to Avshalom entirely. The king, of course, was unaware. He didn't dream that his own son would betray him, but that's exactly what was going on unbeknownst to him. So now, with the public support and also a small but loyal force which he had amassed, Avshalom decided to act. He sent messengers to all the regions of Israel, telling them that he was planning on declaring his kingship soon, and they should await his signal, essentially. He gathered his men in Hebron, assembled even more forces, and in addition managed to acquire the linchpin of this whole rebellion, Achitophel. Achitophel, the king's top general, decided to place his lot with Avshalom, betraying the king in secret and bringing a sizable force with him. This is the thing that really changed things. Achitophel was a strategic genius and an incredible military commander, and whoever had him on their side was pretty much guaranteed to win the war, no matter the amount of forces. He was just simply that good. So much so, in fact, to the point when David would find out about the betrayal, his prayer to God was that God should frustrate Achitophel's counsel. So, Avshalom had the support, the armies, a general to command them, and all the means necessary to wage this war. So he made his move. He announced his sedition, crowning himself the new king of Israel, and set his armies to march on Jerusalem. David heard about all this, his son's betrayal, and was rightly upset, and afraid too. Achitophel was gone, and Avshalom was bearing a massive force upon his capital, so much so that any attempts at defending it would be fruitless. His armies were too spread out and wouldn't be able to reach and defend him in time. Achitophel had played his hand well, using the element of surprise to their advantage. David's only option now was to flee, so he and a few others, including Yoav, who were still loyal to him, escaped Jerusalem and hid in the countryside, while Avshalom and his armies marched into Jerusalem, seizing the capital. David, however, began taking counteractions immediately. He sent spies to make their way into Avshalom's inner circle, with express orders to try and make him and Achitophel's alliance break apart. In addition, he went to meet up with Mephibosheth, his basically adopted son of his friend Jonathan, only to find out from some of his servants that he too had sided with Avshalom, thinking that this was his opportunity to reattain his family's lost royalty. And that wasn't the only member of the house of Saul to turn to Avshalom. Another of Saul's progeny came across David as he traveled secretly with his retinue and began yelling insult at him, telling him that all this was because David had overthrown his family's house, so clearly the descendants of Saul weren't too happy with him. David's officers offered to cut him down where he stood, but David denied this, accepting this upon himself and leaving the man to his words. There was more pressing matters to be dealt with. In the meantime, David's spies arrived in Jerusalem. It was a guy named Hushai, and he wasted no time at all in explaining himself to Avshalom as to why he had betrayed David and sided with Avshalom instead, with plenty of flattery on top of that, and earning a close place by his side. Now, over in Avshalom's capital, there was a bit of an issue. All of the people who had sworn loyalty to the new king were getting a bit nervous. See, they loved Avshalom, but they weren't totally sure he had fully committed to this whole civil war thing, as they worried he might just make reconciliation with the king, repenting to him as he was his father after all, and then give him back his old place as the king. And then anyone who fully committed to Avshalom's cause would be in serious trouble. So Avshalom wondered, how could I provide security to my followers? So he turned to Achitophel for advice. Achitophel's advice was pretty strange, mind you, but actually kind of logical. He told Avshalom that he'd have to lie with his father's concubines, with everyone being made aware of this fact. This, although kind of being a bit weird, would permanently drive a wedge between him and the king and make reconciliation utterly impossible from here. Therefore, anyone on the fence would no longer be able to wait and see what happened. Everyone would have to cast their lot with him fully and give him their full support. So, Avshalom followed this piece of advice. When Achitophel told you to do something and you listened, things had a way of working out for you. In fact, it says, quote, that the advice which Achitophel gave was accepted like an oracle sought from God. So, yeah, this guy knew what he was talking about. And, of course, this piece of advice worked. David was deeply upset when he found out about this, and everybody else saw that there really was no turning back from here and put their lots in with Avshalom. So now the only question was that of war, which was where Achitophel gave an incredibly vital piece of advice, which he said was absolutely paramount. David was on the run. They had used their element of surprise, seized the capital, and amassed a massive force. David, in the meantime, had a small, beleaguered force, which was out wandering the countryside. But it was slowly but surely gathering in strength. If they sent out their troops now, right now, using their current advantage to strike at David's smaller encampment, they could overwhelm him and crush him before he could amass any strength. But the main thing that Achitophel stressed was that it had to be right now. This was their opportunity, and if they didn't act now, then things could get out of hand really quickly. Avshalom listened and liked the advice. It was logical, concise, well-reasoned, like usual. Typical of Achitophel, and he was about to follow through with it too, which would have been absolutely devastating and probably would have ended the war right then and there. But he had this new, very good friend who had ingratiated himself to him with flattering, yet true, of course, words, named Hushai. So, just to be safe, he summoned him too and asked him for his advice on the situation. Hushai took one look at Avshalom's plans and laughed. The notion was ridiculous, he said. The whole plan hinged on them being able to capture and execute the king, but, did you really think that the king would be so foolish as to be staying within his encampment with such a threat? He was, without a doubt, hiding elsewhere, and if they rushed in now and attacked the encampment, oh, sure, they might win, but that's not what the people would say. They would see him sending out his massive military force for the first time, suffer many casualties, presumably, and then return empty-handed without a king to execute. So, surely, oh wise and intelligent Avshalom, it would be much more prudent to wait a period, amass all of our armies until we can secure David's location and launch an attack all at once, then guaranteeing our victory, instead of wasting our opportunity on right now. They argued back and forth for a while, Achitophel and Hushai, but Avshalom actually began listening a bit more to Hushai. Achitophel began to get a bit panicked now. He had done the math, he knew the calculations. If they didn't attack now, like he had said, then David would regroup before them, and they would be defeated and all executed as traitors. He insisted he had never been wrong before, they always listened to him and things always worked out, and yet the more they argued, the more Avshalom leaned towards Hushai. Achitophel was positively frantic now. If they didn't listen to him here and now, they were all dead men in his eyes, and yet Hushai, with his flattery and smiles, won the heart of Avshalom, and it was decided that they would amass their armies and wait. Achitophel was stunned. This was it then. He was a practical, logical man. He knew the only possible outcome from here. He left the palace, went home, set his affairs in order, and then hung himself. And now Avshalom had lost his best advisor and his advantage, thanks to the works of the spy. A report was sent to David, who began arranging his army to form a preemptive strike. He amassed his armies, divided them between his generals, Yoav leading a force, of course, and while he wanted to lead this offensive himself, he listened to sounder minds, knowing that losing the king in battle would be disastrous, and it would be much more logical to direct things from the back, where he wasn't in any actual danger. Avshalom, in the meanwhile, had no such sound advice any longer. He, in his vanity, had surrounded himself with fools and flatterers and a spy, and decided that he would lead the charge himself. And so, war preparations were made, and the armies marched out, father against son, although David ordered his commanders that if anyone came across Avshalom, they should take him alive, still harboring a feeling of love for his estranged son. The battle was fought through the forests of Ephraim, giving the tactical advantage to David, and he had gathered his armies in time, and Avshalom had taken too long. The armies slammed against each other through the trees, men fought and died, and Avshalom atop his regal steed hacked away at men with his sword, charging throughout the trees. Now, generally speaking, charging around in a forest on a horse in the middle of a battle isn't a great idea, particularly, if there's a war going on, and especially if you're not wearing a helmet, which Avshalom wasn't, exposing his long hair to the wind. So, as the battle fought on, Avshalom rode on, pursuing men at a rapid pace, when all of a sudden he was yanked off his steed. His hair had gotten tangled in the branches of a tree, becoming ensnared, and wrenching him off his horse, leaving him to dangle helplessly in the air. He struggled awkwardly, and as he tried to free himself, Yoav, the commander, approached him with some soldiers. The soldiers refused to kill Avshalom, remembering the king's orders against harming his son, but Yoav decided that enough was enough. He took 3 spears, and one after the other, rammed them through Avshalom's body, leaving him hanging there from the tree, impaled, before a soldier stepped forward and finished him off. Avshalom was cut down and dumped into a large pit before having stones piled atop his grave. Messengers were sent back to David, back home, and he was informed that they were victorious, but that his son had been slain during the fighting. David wept for his son, saying that he wished he had been killed in his stead. It said that David's cries and prayer for his son were strong enough to ascend Avshalom's soul to heaven. And so the king and his armies returned, victorious, but mournful. It had been a short, pointless war, pitting brother against brother. The dead were countless, and nothing had really changed besides all of the losses. David resumed his leadership and delivered justice to all the traitors, which was a long and arduous process. The other piece of news was that, as it turns out, Mephibosheth, his semi-adopted son of his dead best friend, claimed he hadn't actually betrayed him. He had remained loyal all along, but the king had been lied to by Mephibosheth's disloyal servants seeking reward, and Mephibosheth could do nothing about it because he was a cripple and couldn't walk around. So that was all resolved. Yoav went out on his own, carrying swift vengeance and retribution. He met privately with some of the main traitors, pretending to greet them in friendship before stabbing them to death in the stomach and leaving them to wander the streets before bleeding out. He continued on. Another had enclosed themselves behind their fortress, so he laid siege for a period and had one of the civilians within, an old woman, use her access to cut off the traitor leader's head and toss it over the wall to him, ending the siege. The remaining traitors, 6 of them, including Mephibosheth, were handed off to the Gibeonites to do with as they pleased, and were all impaled on spikes. And that was pretty much that, finally. But then the Philistines started acting up again, attacking from the south, and nearly assassinating the king. There was fighting at Goth, with an enemy champion who had 6 fingers on each hand who was slain. And then there was a famine, and then there was a plague after that. You get the idea. David had a lot on his plate, even right after a civil war with his son. And things weren't as idealistic as they had once been. David was tired, very tired. He had lived a long life and had fought many wars, spending nearly his entire life at war, and he was old now and worn. He spent his nights alone, waking at midnight as the wind blew through his open window to strum against his harp stringings, waking him up, to then stay awake all night and compose psalms, little poems, praising and thanking God for all that had occurred throughout his life, or whether it be good or ill. The book of Psalms, containing 150 of such poems, or the book of Tehillim in Hebrew, is his masterwork, his magnum opus, and are recited each day all over the world as a part of prayers for health, safety, children, happiness, or otherwise. The kingship would pass on to his younger son, Solomon, a very bright young boy, and finally, at the age of 70, David passed away. It says in the Talmud that the angel of death couldn't kill him, as he was constantly engaged in Torah study, without any breaks whatsoever, so the angel of death was forced to push down a tree to cause a loud noise and distract him just for a moment so that it could claim his life. Young Solomon found the body and arranged for the funerary procession and burial before the crown would finally pass on to him. And that was the end of King David. His life is pretty fascinating, if not a bit tragic, losing his friends and mentors to war or otherwise, before finally fighting his own son in a civil war, and barely ever getting a moment's respite from all this fighting. But still an incredibly important figure, and his line would extend on until this day, his line being the line of royalty and kingship and the house of Yehuda. In fact, it's a known point, as taught by Maimonides and many others, that one day the King Mashiach that will appear will be a direct descendant of King David and the tribe of Yehuda. Solomon would in his own time have his own list of legends and adventures, and eventually build the first temple, securing King David's legacy and establishing a peace for generations to come. And that's about it for King David. I hope you enjoyed the video and maybe learned something new. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great night.